Okay, Lecture 6.1, Gain from the root locus. So, in what follows, we will be primarily concerned with the locations on the root locus that yield desirable transient response characteristics. But knowing the location on the root locus at which we would like to operate requires that we know the implicit gain associated with placing the closed loop poles at that location. We did it. We talked about it a little bit in terms of MATLAB, how to do it last time. We're going to take a step back and see in general how we would do that. This lecture demonstrates two methods of finding the gain associated with a given location on the root locus. The first one is the analytical one, and then the next one is this numerical one, essentially using MATLAB, computer-based one. So recall at the beginning of Chapter 5, in Lecture 5.1, we defined the root locus magnitude criterion to be that the magnitude of k g of s h of s, which is the open loop transfer function, including the gain, the controller gain, must be equal to 1. So this controller gain k can be solved for in this equation. And it's simply that k equals 1 over the magnitude of GH. And I think that it's best to say evaluated at psi, the test point. And I maybe should put k, I mean we didn't put k as a function of psi up here, but I'll maybe put that in. It's just to keep track of why we're writing this expression down. K is a function of psi. Psi is some closed loop pole location. Now, this is only valid if that psi value that you put in is actually on the root locus. Okay? It's not on the root locus. If psi is not on the root locus, then there's no gain that's going to get you there. So whatever you get back, if you plug in something that's not on the root locus, it'll tell you, it might tell you some gain value, but that's not going to actually be, you can't actually get there. You can't actually have your closed loop pole location there. So you have to have some valid closed loop pole location on your root locus to plug in, and then you can find out what the gain is. So, I mean, that's actually, that's just the analytic expression for this. And you can program this into MATLAB, for instance, and you can just find what the gain would be for any closed loop pole location that you give it. It'll give you the gain. Analytic response or expression, and very precise. But we can also look at this in another way that can allow for a sort of geometric, maybe paper by hand way of calculating the gain. So consider this in terms of the gain k poles p and 0 z of the forward or of the open loop transfer function gh. Note that this is little k and it's exclusive of the controller gain big K. So this little k is in g and h. Okay, this little k. So are the poles, so are the zeros. They're all coming from gh. Little k, p, and z. So we can rewrite equation 6.2 using this interpretation from lecture A1, which was saying that we can think of the evaluation of a transfer function at a given test point as being the magnitude would be the length of all of the product of the lengths of all of the vectors that go from each pole location to the test point divided by the product or of the zeros, I guess. Zeros divided by the product of the lengths of all of the poles or lengths of all of the vectors going from pole locations to the test point. And then there's also that open loop gain factor in there. So we looked at that in that lecture, in that appendix, and we can use that to interpret how to come up with our k of psi in this sort of geometric way. So we have this 1 over factor, so we've got to take that into account, but it's the product over the j poles of the magnitude of the vectors going from psi, or going from each pole location, pj, to the test point psi. Divided by, and we've got our little k, which I'll use this k, so that k, times the product of all of the zeros, all of the lengths from the zeros to the test point. So this allows for a geometric interpretation. So the gain is equal to the product of the lengths of the vectors that originate at zeros and terminate the test point divided by the product. Wait, I have that mixed up, don't I? Originate at poles divided by the product that originate at the zeros and terminate at the test point. So this is illustrated in figure 6.1. So this is the, I think it's really hard to actually interpret this unless you look at an example of it. So this is an example of it in this figure. So if you want to find the gain, the controller gain, to make our closed loop pole location, one of the closed loop pole locations be psi, so at this point on the root locus, then what we can do is we can take the product of the length of the vector going from P1 to psi, so this length, with the product of the length of the vector going from this pole to psi, and the product with the product and a further multiplication with the length of the vector from this pole to psi, divided by the length of this zero, the vector from this zero to pi, or to psi. To psi. That's a mouthful. It's a jumbled up mouthful. So, and then we've also got that factor of k, which I didn't give the transfer function, but it would also be scaling this. So if you want to know those lengths, all you need to do is use a good old-fashioned Pythagorean theorem or whatever. We're in the plane, so we can just find the root sum square of these two distances to find the hypotenuse to get all these lengths, right? And it's good to keep in mind that so say you had a figure that was to scale. If you had a root locus figure to scale, you could even use like a ruler to give you these lengths, right? And you can find these products. Or if it just happens to be geometrically easy to read off the graph what the lengths are, that's another way to go with it. So this is one way to evaluate these, get these controller gains. I only encourage this way as a sort of like a little bit of a deeper intuition into things, but realistically, this is mostly useful as an academic exercise because we can do it by hand, okay? But like, I don't really like giving you guys those sorts of tools to learn. Like when I said sketch the root locus, but you don't need to be super precise about it, just qualitatively correct. It's the same way that I feel about this. Really don't need to learn that well how to do hand calculations of gains unless we have to do an in-class final exam, which is, sadly, I have to find that out still, but it's possible we have to do that. But instead, I would recommend using gain the easy way, which is to find it numerically, and we've already talked about how to do that in MATLAB. I give yet another example of how to select the gain on the root locus using the data cursor in MATLAB. So open the root locus figure and use the data cursor to click on the graph and see what the gain is associated with that. That is the way that I recommend when you're actually doing controller design, and hopefully, and on your homework, I recommend doing that. Unless there's some reason we can't use the computers for the final exam, I recommend using the MATLAB way all the time. So, any questions about that? Okay, I'll see you guys Friday.